evening, everyone, and welcome to Wild Live. I'm Gillian Burke. I'm a biologist, a TV presenter, and vice president of the Wildlife Trusts. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening. I'm looking after wildlife for Craig Bennett, CEO Craig Bennett. An absolute pleasure to do so as well. Tonight, we are discussing how we can support neonic-free farming. Now, what is that? Well, we're going to be talking about a class of insecticides, neonicotinoids, which I'm sure a lot of you here will know were banned for use in the EU and the UK back in 2018. And after a lot of campaigning and a lot of petitioning, and I'm sure like me, you would have signed a lot of those petitions. We thought we won, right? So why are we still here? Why are we still talking about these pesticides? Why are the petitions still landing in our inboxes? Why does it feel like we're going round and round in circles? So the issue is very specific. It's about one arable crop, sugar beet. It affects one group of farmers, beet farmers. It's about one product, sugar, that pretty much every single one of us consumes on one way or another. And it's about one company, British Sugar, which controls much of the UK market. So from that perspective, this is actually quite a hopeful moment. There's a lot of hope that things can change because that means we've got one lever to pull in order to end the use of neonics once and for all. And that's by supporting the farmers who themselves want to go neonic-free. So it's a really exciting evening we've got lined up, a lot of discussion, some experts on the panel. Before we dive in, I do want to introduce the panel because, we're going to have some really fantastic perspectives. First up, we're going to have Anabel Kindersley. She's the co-owner of Neal's Yard Remedies, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, absolutely beautiful products. Anabel it's a modern apothecary that blends nature science in the belief that health and beauty should be more natural, less synthetic. And probably most importantly, Anabel in 2022 led a coalition of more than 100 businesses across beauty, luxury, food, and more to fight the UK government's authorization of the use of these harmful pesticides. We've also got on the panel Dave Goulson, Professor of Biology at the University of Sussex and Ambassador for the Wildlife Trust. I'm sure you've seen him on previous Wild Lives. Dave is a leading expert in the UK on insects with a particular focus on bumblebees. He's worked on the Wildlife Trust's Action for Insects campaign and is a wonderful writer, published author, shortlisted for various prizes, and acclaimed for books like The Garden Jungle and A Sting in the Tail. And in 2006, Dave founded the Bumblebee Conservation Trust to engage the public in taking action to save this group of insects. Next up, we have John Pawsey, who's here really to represent farmers who have already made that leap to farming pesticide-free. So John is an organic farmer. He's the owner of Shimpling Park Farms Limited, grows a range of crops as well as a breeding flock of sheep. And he converted to organic production in 1999. So he's got a few decades under his sleeve now of experience with that. And he's improved farm soils, he's increased biodiversity, and has also run a profitable farm, which is no small feat. Then Vicki Hurd. Vicki Hurd is Strategic Lead for Agriculture at the Wildlife Trusts. She's a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society, an award-winning expert, author, strategist, senior manager who's been working on environment, food, and farming issues for over 30 years. And as strategic lead on agriculture at the Wildlife Trusts, Vicki undertakes policy, research, and related lobbying activities, and she provides comment and guidance on these issues. Vicki is also a big nature lover, as you would expect. She's a writer, and her latest book, Rebugging the Planet, is a homage to insects, the little things, and other invertebrates, and why they're essential to our ecosystem and what we can do to help them. So we did invite British Sugar. I mentioned them earlier. We did invite them onto the panel. Unfortunately, nobody was available to represent them. So this is it. This is the panel. And I'd like to welcome Vicki, my first sort of panelist. And Good evening, Vicki.
Good evening, Gillian.
Lovely to see you, Vicki.
Mm,
Um, as strategic lead for agriculture at the
mm,
Wildlife Trust, you're probably really well placed to set the scene,
mm,
and let's start with some real basics. Because there will be people who may not know or be
mm,
aware, like what are neonicotinoids? A bit of a
mm,
mouthful.
mm,
Um, when were they banned? Why were they banned?
mm.
Why have they been approved for use again? What's the story with that, Vicki?
Yes. It does seem odd, doesn't it?
Mm.
To make things easier, I sometimes shorten it to neonics, so neonicotinoids. Um, the Wildlife Trust has long been concerned with the use of insecticides and wider pesticides in farming because of the impact that has not only directly on our wildlife, plants and animals, and on our health, but the indirect effects, how it allows monocultures and more uniform farming and cropping that is bad for nature and creates a real problem for nature in terms of fragmentation of habitats, stopping animals moving through fields and through hedgerows and things like that. There's a lot of problems that are associated with the kind of farming that uses insecticides. But this one is a particularly bad one. It's been known for many years, sort of decades, to be extremely harmful to bees, honeybees, wild bees, bumblebees, and we absolutely need to be protecting our bees. They are critical, absolutely critical for pollination services, both within our crops, our fruit and veg, our cereal, all sorts of crops, but also our wildlife and wider wild environment, which we all need for our well-being and for nature to thrive. And we need nature to thrive for all sorts of reasons. So these neonicotinoids are what you'd call neurotoxins. They affect the neurological systems within the bees, and they're extremely toxic, killing the bees or making them so ill that they will die eventually. And it's one thimble of neonicotinoids, it's said, can kill 4 lorry loads of bees. It's that toxic, over 1 billion bees. That's just so critical that we take that toxin out of the environment. And we've known this for a long time. I remember doing a piece of work on neonicotinoids in 2010, on how we could get it out of the sugar beet industry. And the European Commission have banned it across Europe, and they have made a legal decision to allow no derogations because of this toxic nature on our wildlife. And it's banned in the UK for almost all uses. Um, but one of the things that has kept coming up for the last 4 years is that the sugar industry, because it has a particular problem with a virus that is transported, it's transported via aphids, the little green bugs that we often see on our roses. They're really good vectors of viruses called virus yellows, and there's 3 viruses that they transport, and it's a particular problem for the sugar beet industry and for sugar beet farmers. And so they've asked for a derogation, which means that they will be allowed to use this banned product. It's still banned, but they've got a derogation that they can use it under certain circumstances. And for that, that's been happening, a derogation, for the last 4 years, which has been extremely frustrating. And the Wildlife Trusts and many others have campaigned, we'll probably hear about those, against that derogation for all the good reasons. And I'm sure we'll hear more about how harmful they are from our other speakers. But it's not just us saying don't do that derogation. The Expert Committee on Pesticides, the Health and Safety Executive, as I said, the European Commission and the European Court of Justice saying no, this isn't going to be used across Europe. It's absolutely incredible that we've had another derogation on the 18th of January this year. The government is listening to a very small section of the food community, I would say, because it's British Sugar that is really putting huge pressure on the government to allow this insecticide. And it's so critical to move off these kind of treadmills, if you see what I mean,
Mhm.
in order to develop the alternatives. And we can talk, I'm sure we'll talk about the alternatives, but one of the critical things is we know nature can be a real ally for farmers in terms of tackling pests and managing pests within economically okay thresholds, allowing
Yeah.
them to manage. So making sure that nature can do that means stopping these sort of toxins being out there. So they're really harmful to nature. It's incredible that we've had a derogation for a fourth year. And what's also very clear, I just want to say that farmers are not keen on using this neonics. That in 2022, the proportion of farmers who decided not to use the derogation was 29%. And last year it was 40%. So 40% of farmers, even though they could use it, and it's an incredibly powerful, useful insecticide, it really works, they decided not to use it. And what we're saying is, even though we got derogation, that those farmers should be really supported this year by British Sugar. And we have a petition which we're asking people to sign and share to put pressure. And we'll give that petition to British Sugar, who have actually said they're willing to talk to us and meet with us and talk about what they can do and what we can do to help beet farmers who aren't using neonics. One of the key things I think we'll find is they really should be helping them by paying them and supporting them properly for the yields that they get, which may be lower yields, but we would call it less but better sugar beet. Why not give them the right kind of rewards for doing the right thing by our bees and by our nature? So we will be sending that petition in. That's one of the things we're asking people to do, to help us do that, to put on the pressure and help those farmers to be nature friendly farmers.
Thank you so much, Vicki. That's a great start in terms of setting the scene. I want to bring Dave Goulson on next, because we just want to focus a little bit on the animals themselves before we move on to the bigger question about how we can support farmers to farm without these pesticides. Dave, good evening. Hi.
Hi,
First of all, I'm just really having to struggle not being starstruck. I did entomology at university a long time ago now, but yeah, Dave is sort of one of those people that when we did entomology, it was really excited to have you on the panel.
Making me feel old now.
No, we're probably not far behind. But Dave, very, very quickly, could you sort of take us into the world of the bumblebee, of bees, of these colonial social insects? What are the impacts of these pesticides on the individual animals, at the colony level, at the population level? How does it affect them, and how does it affect the wider environment?
Yeah, so where do I start? So I'll tell the recap a bit and fill in some of the gaps of what Vicki said. So back in the late 90s, neonics were first used in about 95. And they're used as a seed dressing mostly, which means they're stuck on the seed of the crop when the farmer buys it and he just sows it in the ground. And the idea is that they're systemic chemicals. They're taken up by the roots of the plant. They make the whole plant, from roots to leaf tips to flowers, poisonous. And almost the first year they were used, French beekeepers started complaining that their bees were dying when they put their hives near sunflower crops or oilseed rape crops that had been treated with these new chemicals. And no one took them very seriously at the time. The French are always protesting about something, as we know, and but they were absolutely right. And so there, eventually, sort of scientific attention started to turn to it, and people started doing studies, and it became pretty clear that they were impacting on honeybees, both killing them outright, and as Vicki said, these things are incredibly poisonous. But even if a bee doesn't get a lethal dose, they have sublethal effects on them. Things like impairing their ability to navigate. So the poor bees get lost when they're out looking for food, and it impairs their immune system, so they're more susceptible to disease and so on. So my background is bumblebees. I've studied bumblebees for the last 30 years. And when all this information that suggested these chemicals were killing honeybees emerged, I decided we should try and find out whether they were doing similar things to bumblebees. So we did experiments. We tried to simulate what would happen to a bee nest if it was feeding on a crop of something like oilseed rape, which would have a neonic in the nectar and in the pollen. And we found that it had really profound effects. The 2 weeks feeding on oilseed rape was enough to reduce bumblebee colony queen production by 85%, which most of them basically just weren't being produced. So that added to the evidence that led the European Union, after a lot of debate, EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, recommended that these chemicals should be banned back in 2012. And in 2013, they were banned on flowering crops across Europe. But then it turned out we looked in honey and nectar, honey and pollen samples from bumblebee and honeybee nests after that 2013 ban. And we found the bees were still being poisoned. And this brings me to what I think is the most important point, that when you use these chemicals as a seed dressing, most of it actually, it turns out, isn't taken up by the crop, which is where the farmer wants it to go. Only about 5% goes into the crop. Most of these toxins is going into the soil and the soil water and leaching into streams, or being taken up by hedgerow flowers, by shrubs, trees, wildflowers growing in the field margin. And so even if the chemical is applied to a non-flowering crop, such as wheat or sugar beet, that still poisons the environment and means that bees end up being contaminated and dying. And so that's why 5 years on, 2018, Europe banned them completely on all crops, including sugar beet and cereals and so on. But of course, they allowed these derogations until last year, when Europe got rid of the derogations entirely. So now Britain is in the unenviable position of being the only country in Europe which is allowing arable farmers to use these incredibly poisonous chemicals on their crops. So we've used the freedom of Brexit to basically poison our country more than everybody else does. The risk is we end up, the dirty man of Europe. Which would be really sad.
There was we've had questions being sent in advance of tonight's event from members. There was a question from Charles, which actually opens up another area which we probably won't go into massively, but I'm just interested in how concerned are you about pet flea collars that have pesticides? Apparently, some of these do have neonicotinoids. Are you concerned about this entering the environment, entering river systems, watercourses?
Yes,
is the answer.
I'm sort of involved in two parallel campaigns at the moment. So while there's been all this fuss about these chemicals and their the use in farming and its impacts on bees and the environment, most people are completely unaware that dogs and cats are routinely being treated with imidacloprid, which is a neonicotinoid. Or fipronil, which is a very similar neurotoxic chemical. Your vet will encourage you to drip them onto the neck of dogs or cats once a month. And the doses, they're actually pretty hefty. So the dose you're supposed to drip every month on the neck of a medium-sized dog is enough to give a lethal dose to 60 million honeybees. And in total, the sales figures suggest that about 4 tons of imidacloprid is going on to dogs and cats. Now, we know imidacloprid is not used in farming, hasn't been used in farming for years, but it's still turning up in rivers consistently. And this other chemical, fipronil, is turning up in 100% of English rivers that we got data from. Almost always at concentrations that are high, that exceed what are deemed to be safe levels. Now, for both of these chemicals, the only plausible source of that contamination is dogs and cats, because they're not used really for anything else at all. The veterinary industry is kind of in a bit of crisis at the moment, having a big row about whether they're really responsible for poisoning all of our rivers or not. But I think the evidence is pretty darn clear that they are. Actually, before I stop rambling, one more thing. There's a danger in all of this that we get really focused on bees. And I love bees, and I'm surprised to find myself saying this, but there are 27,000 species of insect thereabouts in Britain. Bees make up 1%, and these chemicals are just as poisonous to dragonflies, butterflies, beetles, everything else. So all the aquatic insects, in the case of this river pollution, are going to be affected by these chemicals.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dave. It's a really sprawling topic. It's not just, like you say, it's not just about the bees. It's about invertebrates. It's about how these chemicals are being used, not just in farming, but pets. But we are going to stick with farming for tonight, because that is a big part, like I said earlier in the introduction, of where we could start to see some changes. So let me bring John on at this stage, our farmer on the panel. Good evening, John.
Good evening.
You've been an organic farmer since 1999. Tell us about that journey. Why the change, and how have you found it?
Okay, so I started farming in 1985, and actually, I think we were conventional farmers, and I ended up actually within a relatively short period of time by doing all the spraying on the farm. And when we started, increasingly we were being asked to put on lots of different mixtures of chemicals. So even though I understood by reading the label about the dangers to aquatic life and various other forms of life on the farm, what I was really increasingly being asked to do, and it's recommended by agronomists, that we were mixing all these chemicals together, and I really began to feel out of control about actually the potential damage that I might be doing. And as I say, I used to sit on the sprayer the whole time, mixing these cocktails up and spraying them on the fields, and I just became increasingly worried about the long-term effect. And the difficulty is when you're running a small business, is that you don't have a massive amount of time to go and really research this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so I just thought, the best possible thing that I could do was just to stop doing it. We had noticed, we've done lots of surveys on the farm since we converted, but we were noticing, decline in species on the farm. And the sort of the road, the thing that really sort of brought the message home to me was when I was spraying and this hare got up in front of the sprayer, and instead of sort of running away from the sprayer, ducked underneath the booms and got coated with the chemicals I was using, and just sat on the headland of the field licking itself. And it was just a very graphic demonstration of what I was hermetically sealed in my carbon filtered cab, and there was a procedure for me to put on sort of various bits of equipment to protect myself when I was getting out of the sprayer, to sort of clean the nozzles if one got blocked or something. But yet I was quite happy to spray absolutely everything, things that I could see, but also things that I couldn't see. And not only that, right up the edges of footpaths and people's gardens. And I just had to stop doing it. We did grow sugar beet, and we live 8 miles south of the sugar beet factory in Bury St Edmunds. And I remember the first time that we ever used, it was a product called Gaucho, which was a neonicotinoid, which was, as Dave said, it was a coating on the seed. And I remember my agronomist coming out, and he said, no, literally, you just plant the seed, you don't have to do anything else, it grows within the crop. And I said, well, how does it work? And this is obviously not scientifically right, but at the time, the information he said to me was that the insect would take up the product while it was feeding on the plant, and it would disorientate it. And I was just thinking about all these disorientated insects being able to get back to where they came from, and I just thought, that's just absolutely bonkers. But of course, everyone loved it when we started using it, because previously what we did, and I don't, it'd be interesting to talk about what farmers are doing now, but pre this chemical, what we used to do is we would ring up our local beekeepers the night before we were going to use an insecticide, and we'd been using a pyrethroid. We would so they could keep their bees in their hives the next morning. Then we would get up at the crack of dawn before insects were foraging, and we would go and spray a pyrethroid to deal with the aphids, and then we'd stop before the insects started foraging, and then alert our beekeepers again. We used to do it first in the morning because, of course, everything forages very late at night, so I always felt happy about doing it in the morning. But still, as a farmer, I just felt that I had to take responsibility for my actions, and even though I didn't have time to really research it, it just sat very badly with me. So the easiest thing for us to do almost 25 years ago now is just stop using them.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I guess you're right. There are the limitations of time, capacity, resources to make some great big change. So there are some real barriers for farmers to make those changes. We're going to come back to that, John, if you may. But I want to just move on to Anabel, because we can just shift the focus on to consumers, people who buy various products. Anabel, good evening.
Good evening.
Pleasure to have you here. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the campaign that you've led with other retailers, and also like how, as consumers, how can we support nature-friendly farming? Do we have, what purchasing power can we levy to be able to bring these changes about?
Well, so for those of you who don't know about Neal's Yard Remedies, we're a health and beauty brand, and we sow, we grow, we bottle. We basically have an eco manufacturing facility in Dorset where we make 90% of what we sell. We use natural and organic ingredients, and we depend on a healthy ecosystem. So for us, it's on a personal level. Obviously, I don't feel proud to be living in the most nature depleted country, or one of the most, and also do feel a responsibility as a business owner, a mother, a citizen, to think a bit further, not such short term, and think about next generation and our impact on the environment and society in general. So as a business, we have campaigned for nature, for, well, in fact, protecting bees. Back in 2011, we were at Downing Street asking government to ban neonics. That feels like a long time ago now. Obviously overjoyed in 2017 when that ban came in, got on and sort of started campaigning about microbeads in beauty products that were going into water, and thought that job was sort of like slightly over. Actually, since then, we've always we have a range called Be Lovely, which we dedicated to a sort of small portion of our proceeds go to bee conservation, which we've given about £360,000 over those 10 years, and we continue to do so. So I think I was just pretty shocked that the derogation had come. I mean, in the beauty industry, if a chemical or something is banned, that's banned, right? That's banned. So you don't then just bring it back in because it suits you. We have margins, and and I have huge sympathy for farmers. I can go into that later, but we also, as a business, have struggled over time. It's not an easy time on the high street with loads of shops, all of that. We're employers. We have to think about the next quarter, but we can't do that at the expense of the next generation. So we're constantly having to battle that sort of make that fine balance and those things. So I really didn't think that was okay. So I gathered a coalition of 105, I think we might actually have 115 or something businesses who also feel the same way. It was a pushing against open door. People do care. A customer survey we did of 17,000 of our customers recently said the second reason to purchase from us was, the first reason was product reviews, which shows that we're making good products. And the second, everyone thought would be price. And it wasn't. It was brand ethics and sustainability and responsible sourcing and all of that. So I think, people do care. And actually, of our 115, or even actually when we were just 100 businesses in that coalition, that represents, even if you just look at their Instagram reach, we're talking about 10 million customers. And that's being conservative. So, that's what people care about. People are considering, people wouldn't buy from us if it wasn't, it's not just the good products, it's what we do and what we stand for. So I think, as a customer, what can you do as you can be curious. You can purchase from, I buy my vegetables from Riverford precisely because I'd rather buy less and buy better. That's a concerted decision, because I know that what they stand for and what they do. John, I probably would have purchased from you, but I didn't know if you do box schemes. And but, I think it's about being curious. As a business owner, I feel it's my responsibility to help my customers who may not have known about the sort of things that I learned from lovely Dave Goulson. If you haven't read his book, Silent Earth, please read it. It's an eye-opener and a tearjerker, but it's a beautiful, beautiful, he's up there. Beautiful, beautiful book. I think it's about being conscious consumer. Personally, I think we all have a responsibility to do that. So I think you have power with your wallet to make those choices. And I think, as a business, we have to make those trade-offs. But I think, reality is a market can dictate how farmers farm. So that's why I've gathered the coalition is I do think if government isn't listening, I thought if I did a three-pronged approach, I've got my customers being informed, which I think is my responsibility. I've also got farmers who we support. Actually, I've been as a bit been supporting, our customers have been supporting Nature Friendly Farming Network with Martin Lyons, who's really not organic, not niche like us, but basically he's doing his best, his very best. So it's like pushing in the right direction. I think if we try all of those things, something's got to stick. And I also think markets can change people's behavior, and then the people want something different, and then they make government change their minds. So I feel like I'm throwing it all at it, and hoping that maybe the government will not do a fifth derogation. I would say that it's, Gillian, 4 derogations is definitely not an emergency, is it?
Yeah, it's a bit of a pattern. I mean, just to echo, I completely agree, 100%. I think people do care. There's another book that's quite old now called Ecological Intelligence, and it was written by the same person that coined the phrase emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman. And there's loads of research in that. It's a bit old now, it's about 10 years old now, but there's plenty in there to show that with the information, people make different choices. The bottom line, the cheapest product isn't the only thing that dictates people's buying habits. We can get into that later on. There's plenty of questions I've seen that are coming in about labeling, about how do we know what we're buying, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this is a really good moment. We've talked a lot about farmers, how we can support farmers who want to start using different methods, different protocols that don't involve these chemicals, these pesticides. We actually invited a farmer called Tom Clark onto the panel. He wasn't able to attend because today is also the NFAU's annual conference, which you may have seen on the news. But he was kind enough to record a video message giving his perspective as a beet farmer who initially 3 years ago supported the derogations, the use of the neonicotinoids, but then decided to try farming without the pesticides. And this is a video talking about his experience.
Hi, it's Tom Clark here, sugar beet farmer from the Cambridgeshire Fens. Speaking to you actually while we're harvesting sugar beet. Sorry I can't be joining you actually with the wildlife. I would love to have done it, but unfortunately it clashes with the NFU conference which I have to attend. So I'm recording this so I can have a little chat with you about my thoughts about neonicotinoids and sugar beet. And I did speak to you all about this about 3 years ago, and joined in a wildlife at the time when the first derogation for the use of thiamethoxam was approved. It's fair to say I was quite a fan of the derogation. I was making the case that it was sensitive, that it was really responsible use, limited, targeted, and it was absolutely necessary. I didn't go on personally to use neonicotinoid treated seed for my sugar beet in the following 2 years. I wanted to try and grow the crop without the use of that chemical to prove it could be done. Now, there are quite a few areas in the UK where people can grow beet with much less risk of virus yellows, which is the disease that causes the yield loss, on the Norfolk coast and up in Yorkshire where it's colder in the winter. But right here in the heart of the Fens, it's not that simple, not that straightforward. And actually it's much more because you can't grow other crops in the rotation that people are cutting back and using neonicotinoids. That really restricts what you can put in your rotation if you're going to include sugar beet. And I think that's a big reason why the area has dropped. The other reason is actually a lot of people stopped growing sugar beet. It was just too risky. There were so many things that could go wrong with sugar beet. Unfortunately, most of them went wrong on my farm. I tried everything. I tried all the scientific advice. I tried releasing predatory insects to combat the aphids instead of using insecticides. I tried camouflaging the crop using barley as a disguise of the young crop when it's growing. I tried spray painting the fields with special dye so that it looked like the field, aphids are attracted to little specks of green against dark, and if you spray the field a different colour, the idea was that they couldn't see the crop and wouldn't be attracted. I tried using contact insecticides, which is the recommended alternative use, and which some experts in the insect NGO world said to me they would prefer us to use sprayed insecticides than using the seed treatments. None of them really worked, and for 3 years in a row I've lost a lot of the business's money growing sugar beet at a loss, at massively reduced yields and at a loss. It came to the point where I decided I could not afford to take that risk anymore, and this year, this crop behind me, the best crop I've grown in 4 years, and it has been grown with Cruiser, thiamethoxam, used as a seed treatment, and I think that is one of the main reasons it's been a much better crop. Now, I'm a nature-friendly farmer. I don't want to be using chemicals in an irresponsible way. I want to do as much as I can to farm sustainably, which means sustainably financially, but also for the environment, and give back more than we take from the land. So there will be answers in the future from disease-resistant varieties being bred. They are coming down the line. There are alternatives. There is hope at the end of the tunnel. But currently, using farming techniques and practices, there really isn't a way to be sure that you can get an economic yield without using neonicotinoids, is my conclusion. So then the question is, if we can't get the yields, and we're not likely to get another derogation next year for neonicotinoid seed treatment, what is the answer? And I think the answer has to be economic rather than scientific measures or farming measures. I think the price paid to the farmer for growing sugar beet has to reflect the fact that the yields are lower, have to be lower, are more risky, more likelihood that they will go up and down depending on the year, depending on the weather. And therefore I think we need to ask the supply chain to take on some of this risk, which means paying more to farmers, giving us more insurance against a bad crop. And in that ways we can continue to farm sugar beet and not import sugar from countries and in systems, and from sugarcane, for example, where the environmental damage is so much greater than it is here in England.
Well, that is a very real talk, as I say, pragmatic suggestions of what can be done. Vicki, I just wanted to bring you on before we open, and I really do want to get to audience questions, as soon as we can. But I just wondering if you can help to join the dots and really land this point home, what Tom ended that video with, that connection between what farmers are up against, particularly in this, we know that their protests, farmers are really being pushed to breaking point. What is this connection between the farmers, British sugar, and how these pesticides are being used? Like, how can we use that to get some kind of change and get these neonicotinoids banned once and for all?
Yes, it was a powerful film, and I really would like to thank Tom for doing that for us. And I've known him for a while, and I was aware of what he was attempting, and he's clearly made 3 years of attempts of using lots of tools. I did read a paper showing there are 80 tools that farmers across Europe are using, a paper that looked at all of them and what might work, and it's clearly much more complicated than just buying some seed with a coat on it of a toxic that will kill everything in the area. So he's really made a big effort, and he's had to drop it because he's a business and he's got to keep going as a business. It's his livelihood, his workers need to be paid, and so on and so forth. And I think it's really telling what he said at the end. And this is a common problem, that farmers are not being paid enough for doing good farming, or even bad farming. But a lot of farmers are great in this country. They're doing, they're trying their best to be environmentally friendly, animal welfare, higher animal welfare, doing all these things despite really low farm gate prices. And that means the retailers are taking too much of the profit, or the intermediaries, the middlemen or intermediaries that are taking too much, or they're just being sold at too low a price. And the other factor is we've got imports coming in potentially with the new trade deals that are going to be undercutting our farmers with produce that will have been produced to standards that we don't allow here, including banned pesticides and pesticide residues in the food and things like that. So there's all these big pressures on farmers. At the same time, they're being asked, quite rightly, to protect and restore nature. You know, we're asking for 30% of nature to be restored by 2030, and for regenerative systems, and to tackle climate change, reduced emissions, so on and so forth. All these pressures that Tom and John and all farmers are under, and I can see why they're protesting. They're really fed up, and the things they're protesting on in terms of trade deals that are going to be really hurtful, and a supply chain that really isn't paying fair. It's very complicated. The supply chain is incredibly complicated, and where the money goes is really hard to find out. That's why we're calling for transparency, rules on transparency within supply chains, and fair dealing legislation. I've been campaigning on this since 2004, and I'm really pleased the government is actually taking notice. And as Rishi Sunak said today at the National Farming Conference, they're implementing a clause from the Agriculture Act in 2020, which will bring in new rules with an enforcer on the supply chain to make sure it's playing as fairer. It won't be enough. We've got a groceries code adjudicator which works on the top 14 big retailers, so this will be getting everything in the middle. But it's still going to be a very concentrated, competitive food system, and that's part of the problem. So we want to see investment in new routes to market for farmers, helping farmers find ways to sell their produce. And that brings me back to British Sugar, which is the only buyer of beet here. So Tom has nobody else to sell to. He hasn't got a choice of who to sell that beet to. And therefore it's really incumbent on British Sugar to do the right thing, to play fair. And as we know, 40% of farmers in 2023 decided to go neonic-free. So they'll be having all the problems that Tom's been having. There's a lot of geographic issues. I think he talked about those, which is quite important and might indicate we should be not producing sugar in some areas. We're also going to get more threats because it's going to get warmer, which is better for aphids. Aphids love the warmth. So we've got to think about all these complex things. But the critical thing that Tom said at the end is they've got to be paid. They've got to be paid a fair reward for doing the right thing. So that less and better. And goodness knows we do need to eat less sugar. That doesn't mean we should be just drawing, if we produce less here, drawing it from the rest of the world. We have actually a tax on sugary drinks. We should have a tax on, really harmful products. That's a whole other issue and I won't get into here. But, if we were starting to really pay farmers the right, amount that would allow them to have a good living, producing less but better sugar, organic sugar, and dedicating manufacturing lines to that, so it could actually be clear that they were getting rewarded for what they were doing, that would make a difference. And providing the advice and support and equipment they need to, for instance, monitor aphid levels and see whether their forecasts are right and what they need to do if they're not, and all the advice about which crops to plant instead, different rotations, possibly doing intercropping where you're mixing a line of beet with another crop like barley or another crop, and reintroducing habitats for those pest predators like beetles, lacewings. They gobble up the pests, they gobble up the aphids. Actually having the habitats for them rather than necessarily having to buy them in. Anyway, there's lots of things, loads of tools. As I said, 80 across Europe have been identified. But that's complex compared with just buying a seed. So the payment's got to be right and the advice has got to be there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vicki. I just wanted to, there's loads of questions coming in. I just wanted to ask this question. This one is from David Whitrick, and possibly John, this may be one for you to answer. The question is, are neonics only used on sugar beet? He thought that it was also used on oilseed rape. Where is the most significant use of neonics on what crop? I don't know if that's a question for John or for Dave. I think Dave has got his hand up. Dave Goulson.
So it is banned for use on all crops, except for this derogation. So the only use of thiamethoxam that's legal in the United Kingdom is use on sugar beet at the moment. which is why, so I posted on Twitter quite recently this maps of river pollution data showing that thiamethoxam is turning up commonly in British rivers, particularly in the sugar beet growing regions of the country. And given that it's not used for anything else at all legally, it kind of seems a no-brainer that sadly sugar beet farmers are polluting our rivers with these toxins.
Mm-hmm. So like I said in the introduction, this really is limited now to one crop and one buyer, I guess, which is British Sugar. Other questions really are to do with, I guess, transparency, whether labeling products as being neonic-free would help the public better support farmers. I know, Anabel, this is something that you likely have looked into. Do you think this has got some traction? And you're muted, Anabel. Just unmute. That's okay.
Sorry about that. I think that's a good question. I think obviously we were the first health and beauty brand to be certified by the Soil Association. So we do believe in third-party certification, and that's no GMOs as well. I mean, there's a whole thing. So I think labeling is important for customers, very important for a consumer. I think getting British Sugar to split out the labeling on neonics, I've gone round and round in my head of how that would work. I think I really tried to approach a few supermarkets and producers, obviously. So I've taken away from just the my view on whether we should all buy organic, because I can see that's not going to go down very well with everyone. But so on a broader brush approach, I think it'd be very good. I feel like we take responsibility to diversify crops or ingredients if we have to phase them out of our products if it doesn't work or there's a shortage of supply. So I really feel for what Tom goes through. Sometimes you lose a crop and you have to adapt, and I've got a fairly big for me business, and so it's quite difficult to manage, but we have to manage it because we've got employees and we have whole manufacturing sites, so it's not just our customers being out of stock, it's also people's livelihoods. But I think the labeling thing is really important, and I think it would be great if supermarkets or food suppliers decided that they just wouldn't want to buy sugar that was contaminated with neonics. I think that would be a start. I think someone did do it once upon a time, but it's definitely hasn't. I think that's after 2017. Dave will probably know that sort of stopped, but I think that would be a good thing. And then if all the retailers stuck together, well, then that would force British Sugar to, and other sugar, it would be, the cycle changes, doesn't it? Well, if the government aren't going to put in the stops, someone has got to.
Yeah. John, is that something that you see as practical from the kind of supply chain and from, kind of how would that work? Would labeling sugar as neonic-free be something that would be useful and even possible, to be honest?
I think that I completely agree with labeling. I mean, people need to know what they're buying. I think that it is. I mean, this derogation has been granted, but let's hope that another one isn't going to be granted. So I think that the only way to really address it really is to just make sure people are aware that if they're buying sugar from producing this country from British Sugar, then actually it probably will contain these products. I think what I really also wanted to address was, we also, we're asked as organic farmers, even though we don't grow sugar beet anymore, because there's no market for it. The British Sugar did run a campaign. They bought, growing organic sugar for them for about 4 years, but it didn't, the sort of segregation and cleaning down of the factories was too costly. And I think they had, difficulties with sort of mixing organic and non-organic crops. But we do suffer from, or potentially we could suffer something called barley yellow dwarf virus, which is a virus spread by aphids in wheat and barley. And people say to us as organic farmers, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that problem? Because it's a real problem in the non-organic system. And we just don't have the problem because we have long, complex rotations. And we're growing lots of different crops within that rotation. The longer, we're growing lots of different crops. And so the whole object behind a sort of systems-based approach is that you're not letting one thing dominate. And I think that, you know, that's a really important thing to understand. By cropping as well, intercropping within those in those actual, you know, we grow very few crops that are grown on their own. They're always grown with something else to spread risk. And just to address the thing about, you know, farmers not being paid enough. One of the reasons for going organic was I was just sick of being a price taker and not having any kind of relationship with our buyers. And although organic food in some cases is more expensive, when you buy it, you don't have all the externalities that a conventional crop where pesticides and artificial fertilizers are being used. And so maybe organic is actually the real cost of food. I don't know.
That's a good point. I think you've also just touched on there was a question that came in from Julie Marshall, and she was asking, why isn't the integrated pest management scheme, so natural pests, killing aphids, etc., proposed by DEFRA, implemented in farming practices? And I guess you've just touched on that, John. But is that something that is coming into play at all here?
I have relatively strong views about the integrated pest management scheme, because all it is it's got no teeth. You know, farmers, and we have to fill one in. We're organic and we don't use any pesticides. We still have to fill it in. It basically takes you on a journey, but actually, you know, it's a principle. It's not a standard. The organic standard is laid down by, you know, it's a legal framework originally set down by European law. IPM doesn't have any teeth. I think it's an initiative, but you know, it's not change. Nothing's changing. And so and until it has some kind of you know, sort of, you know, teeth, I you know, I don't personally think it's worth the paper it's printed on.
Okay, Vicki, you had
I
your
was
hand
just
up.
going to mention what the person might have been asking about was also the IPM action that is available under the new post-Brexit farm payment scheme. And I totally understand what John's saying there, and IPM has not delivered. Obviously, it's better that farmers are on a journey and are learning about these things, but doesn't seem to have really penetrated from a system approach, which John was talking about. You need the whole system to be working to manage that pest threat. But the IPM action, farmers will be paid an amount per hectare to deliver lower insecticides or no insecticides, and flower margins to help pest predators, and do an integrated pest management plan for the whole farm. So that's a new scheme that farmers will be able to apply for, and that's, in theory, will be enforced. You know, farmers will be reporting on how they've done and the fact they're not using insecticides. So that's a positive move, which will become, you know, will be useful for farmers to get on board, and they will be paid because they're delivering public goods through that approach. They'll also be getting goods for themselves, for the farm system, but they'll also be, you know, restoring nature. So that's a public good that government has seen important to pay for.
Dave, I just wanted to go back to you. I think we've actually got the image that you'd referred to, the one that you tweeted on, showing the pesticides traces being found in watercourses and that relationship with where sugar beet is being farmed. I think that's it up there. So just talk us through this again, please, Dave.
Okay, cool. So on the left, the blue dots are rivers that the Environment Agency found thiamethoxam in the last 4 years, during the years where these derogations have been granted. And on the right, the coloured blobs on the map show the sugar beet growing regions of Britain. That map is slightly old, but it was the newest one I could find. Now you can see there's a pretty good correlation. It's not perfect. There are some odd blue dots in places which you wouldn't expect there to be any sugar beet. And I can't explain those. I have no idea what's going on in Middlesbrough, where there seem to be several dots north of any sugar beet. But nonetheless, most of the river contamination is in sugar beet growing territory. And given, as I said, that this stuff isn't allowed to be used on anything else at all, it's not used on pets, it's not cats and dogs, there's no other real explanation as to how it's getting there. really strongly suggests to me that that pollution is probably some or a lot of it coming from sugar beet.
So let me just clarify, because I've been referring to neonicotinoids as this whole family of pesticides, but this is actually picking out a particular, like,
yeah,
a particular product.
Thiamethoxam. They give them these ridiculously long names, which are incredibly hard to pronounce and remember. But anyway, so for example, the one used on dogs and cats is imidacloprid. Thiamethoxam is also a neonic. It's the one being used on sugar beet. But it's chemically distinct. So those blue dots are thiamethoxam, which is only allowed to be used. Sorry if I'm repeating myself, but it is important, I think. If it's polluting our rivers, then that's really concerning, because the derogation is based on all sorts of measures being implemented to try and stop the environment being damaged. If the stuff is swirling around in it, well, we all know our rivers are full of all sorts of stuff these days. We really don't want to be adding potent neurotoxins to the mix.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, another thing that strikes me looking at that map, and I know it's something that you really unpacked the last time there was a wildlife on neonics, was the areas where sugar beet is now grown was traditionally where fruit and veg was grown. And could you just help us a little bit? Yeah, like I said, I know we've sort of got lots of other stuff to talk about. I think that's a really important point, Dave, that you made previously. And if you could just remind us of that.
Yeah, so I would argue, and bear with me if you're a farmer, don't start throwing tomatoes, but I don't think it would be a bad thing if we grew less sugar beet. If there are parts of Britain where farmers find without neonics they can't grow it, it wouldn't be so bad. And people will say at this point, well, hang on, if we don't grow it ourselves, we've got to import it. But that only assumes that we don't grow anything else in those fields instead. If farmers instead grew something, one of the other fruits and vegetables that we currently export lots of, and bear in mind we import about 70% of our fruits and veg, if they switch from sugar beet to something else, then that's not actually increasing imports at all. And given, secondly, which I think is a really important point that Vicki touched on, sugar's really bad for us. Do we really want to poison the environment to grow something which is actually poisonous to us? It's the major driver of the obesity epidemic we have, of diabetes, which is estimated to cost 17 billion to the economy. If you read Henry Dimbleby's really good national food strategy, he recommends various ways by which we could encourage people to eat less sugar. So it seems to me, basically we should be supporting farmers to transition away from growing something that we actually shouldn't be eating in the first place to growing healthy stuff that's good for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point. It touches on all kinds of things: food justice, people having access to more nutrient-dense food, all kinds of stuff. Anabel, I see you nodding along there. Is there anything you want to add to that as well? And just unmute for yourself there so we can hear you, Anabel.
I mean, yes, exactly. Well said, Dave. I think from a well-being perspective, that's always sort of, no one really wants to talk about that, do they? Obviously we want to support farmers to transition, but is sugar beet the right crop if it's failing? And we are in a climate emergency and we do have to adapt. And so I think, looking at all of those things in the round, we have to look at everything holistically, don't we? We have to look at our health, our well-being, and the environment, the well-being of our farmers. It's all tied up. So I think Dave's well said. I think we need to look at how we need to talk to each other. I think that's the whole point about working together. This isn't one person's getting it right and others are getting it wrong. It's let's work together and try and find a solution. And I think that's where business comes in, because we're very used to finding pragmatic solutions. Because if we die by, you can see what happens to retailers like us. So it's a tricky time, but we need to work together for a better environment and I think and a healthy society.
Yeah. John, there's a question that's come in just asking, and I guess this is sort of echoes what Anabel's talking about, working together. The question is from Nicole Ferguson, and she's asking, maybe current successful organic farmers, so I guess that's alluding to you, could help teach other farmers how to avoid crop disease and pests, run workshops, webinars. Do you have the time for that? Is that practical? Do you have a receptive audience? How would that look?
Absolutely. And actually, I do spend quite a lot of my time. I'm going to Yorkshire not tomorrow, the next day, to speak to a group of farmers. It's an AHDB monitor farm, and there's lots of these farms around the place, and they do invite people like me, not using pesticides, to go and talk to farmers. But I would also say that actually, you know, the wonderful thing about agriculture in this country is everybody is doing something different. And what I find when I go and talk to people, usually people go and talk to me because I got lumped into a sort of a type of discussion, and so possibly the people who are coming to see me are, you know, more enlightened in this sort of in this area. But generally farmers are incredibly inventive, and because we're all doing something different, when you get a group of farmers in a room, you know, the answer is usually there, and I think that's incredibly exciting. I mean, you know, things are changing. I've been sort of damning about IPM, but actually with the sort of you know, with regenerative farmers sort of wanting to use less pesticides, you know, in my sort of 20+ years of farming organically, I think over the last, I'm going to say 5 to 6 years, you know, this conversation is really starting, and it's really, really important. I sometimes feel quite sad that organic, you know, food hasn't really taken off in this country, because I think it really, you know, solves a lot of the problems in terms of, you know, what we're trying to do to sink more carbon and to reverse decline in nature. But actually, do you know what? It's about outcomes, and if people are slowly moving on that journey, and it's regenerative sort of, you know, thing, well, you know, that's great. And I think so. I think I'm feeling positive. I think it's good news.
Okay, great. There's a few more questions that come in, which well, one is an interesting one because it sort of reaches outside of Britain and it's out of Europe even. The question is from Marion Harding. It asks, are neonics used outside of Europe? And it makes me think of the kind of unintended consequence of, you know, banning pesticides in Britain and Europe, and where those sort of banned pesticides end up in other countries, global South countries. It's hugely complex. Dave, I don't know if that's something that you want to tackle.
Just briefly, yes, they used enormously all over the world. Europe is the only region of the world which has significant bans and restrictions on neonic use. So food we import from outside Europe has almost certainly been treated with neonics, which raises all sorts of issues over the fairness of that, level playing fields for farmers in this country competing against, and also raises the issues of these trade deals that we're signing up to with countries with much lower food production standards than we have. There's also, just to add as well, a certain hypocrisy to Europe in this, in that we're quite happy for companies, European companies with factories in Europe, to manufacture neonics and sell them to the rest of the world. That's completely fine, apparently, morally, by Europe. So they're too dangerous for our wildlife, but it's fine if we poison all the wildlife in Brazil or Africa or wherever.
Yeah, well, it's like I said, it's a sprawling topic, and yeah, a lot of challenges. But you know, bringing it back to the focus for tonight, Vicki, did you want to add anything to that as well?
I was just going to say, if anybody wants to know a bit more about that, I was involved in producing some reports with the Pesticides Action Network called Toxic Trade. And it looked at the trade deals that the UK is doing with Australia, New Zealand, the Trans-Pacific one, and India. And as Dave said, there's such risks there because their regulatory regimes and licensing is vastly different from ours and Europe. And yeah, neonics is one of the big threats, but it's certainly not the only one. But also the UK could be and should be really a leader and really championing the kind of policies and core standards that we want to see across the globe, which will protect workers and eaters, as well as farmers and the nature. That is what we should be doing. And by having this derogation, it sort of undermines, and what Dave says, you know, the idea that we're producing some of these toxic chemicals just for export is not good. But having those core standards, and they were mentioned by Richie Sunak today, actually, at the National Farmers Union conference, and he was challenged on that. We've been calling for core standards for trade deals for a long time. And yeah, sorry, could go on all about that, but look at those toxic trade reports in the Pesticides Action Network. There's a lot of info there.
Yeah, well, thanks, Vicki. There's actually quite a few questions coming in about how these pesticides actually affect us, our own health. We've talked about how they affect bees and bumblebees and the environment, but what about human health? So we've got a question from Mary H, A. Jessen, and Janet Knott, all in this kind of area, which is A, how long do neonics persist in the environment and enter the food chain? You know, are they dangerous to us? All those sorts of questions. I'm not sure who would like to take that. Dave.
Yeah, so they're quite persistent. It depends where they are. If they're in soil, they can last for a few years, worst case scenario. They don't bioaccumulate, so it's not like mercury or whatever that builds up in us if we eat other organisms. And the good news is that they are less persistent, less toxic to vertebrates like us than they are to insects. They're really, really toxic to insects, as we explored earlier, much less so to us. But that said, we are exposed to them all the time through our food and contact with the environment. And there was a really disturbing study from Switzerland a couple of years ago now, where they screened the cerebrospinal fluid of children for neonics, and 100% of the children tested had detectable amounts of neurotoxins bathing their brain. And that suggests it's happening, you know, it's chronic exposure over long periods. Hopefully it's not doing us any harm, but you know, I'd rather not have my children's brain awash with neonicotinoid. Thanks very much.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed, wholeheartedly. Question from Helen Wrigley. Should the NFU be more radical in its approach to organic farming? Is it holding farmers back? Yeah, what is this relationship? You know, we've been talking a lot about British sugar, but the NFU have their annual conference today. John, do you want to speak on that a little?
I was chair of their organic forum for a while, and one of the main reasons for doing that is because I think traditionally the NFU has been a very conservative organization, and I think it's very important that it sees the colour of its members and the diversity, which is, I think, you know, our real strength. And I think that it hasn't been great at that in the past. I think it is certainly getting better. But yes, I mean, you know, when we first converted, you know, those years ago, Elliot Morley launched the organic farmer scheme, the new organic farmer scheme on our farm. The government used to talk about organic farming and the benefits you would get from organic food production, but nobody's talking about it anymore. And I just think it doesn't give farmers the confidence to make that leap. I think that it's had a little bit of a problem with explaining what it actually is. My own personal opinion is I think that it is better for you if you don't want to if you're worried about ingesting pesticides, then eat organic food. But as far as I'm concerned, and looking at the surveys that we've done on the farm, I'm also a big fan of Dave Goulson's book Silent Earth. I read it recently, and actually it was a it made me feel very good about the journey that we've been on, because it's a very worrying book. But I think that we just need to talk about it more and understand the benefits of organic farming, and to give people the confidence to convert.
There is a lot of questions about how we can band together, how we can put more pressure on rejecting suppliers who are using neonics, et cetera, et cetera. There's one particular question from Mary H, which also then goes into anti-competition legislation and the issues around that. I don't know whether that's a question for Anabel or for Vicki, just to talk about, how that works. Anabel.
Yeah, I mean, actually, who is the person who asked that question?
Just down as Mary H. So the question, I'll read it out because it's quite particular. It's, would retailers banding together reject suppliers using neonics run into anti-competition or anti-competitive legislation problems?
I think that's a really good question. I think when I first started campaigning, and I think there were a few raised eyebrows, like, well, why would you campaign with other people in the beauty industry? Surely you're like, anti-competition rights. But actually, I think people have come a long way from that. I think that, I belong to the Sustainable Beauty Coalition. We are, members are all in huge businesses in the beauty industry, and we all campaign together. So I think that you can put that side apart. You don't have to talk about pricing. You just have to talk about what's good for the environment and work together to find strategies. I don't think any single business is going to make a difference. I think we're all going to have to stick together. Every citizen, every person is going to have to stick together to make the world a better place. So I think I've really brushed that aside, and I haven't seen any problems with it so far. I mean, yes, I think there may be that the thing about competitive advantage, but you have to, in a sense, it's an environmental campaign, and therefore it shouldn't matter. I think we need to rise above that personally.
Okay.
I mean, we have to obviously separate, talking about pricing and all that competitive advantage. But if you're not talking, I mean, I set up Stand By Bees, the campaign, and specifically didn't call it Neal's Yard Remedies because I didn't want anyone to think it was a marketing activity. And so, I've got on there, anyone can join. You just send me an email and you can have your logo up there. And then we use that together to work together to try and ask the government to not have another derogation. But
please.
so far, but I think that's the thing is I think as long as you're not talking about pricing and that sort of thing, then I think it's completely fine.
I think we've got time for a couple of more questions. There was one from Bill Grayson asking, have replacement chemicals now being used this is replacement chemicals that are being used instead of neonics. Are they also subject to rigorous testing? I don't know. The question is, are there alternatives to neonics and are they being tested?
Well, shall I just say there are, Dave, probably more detail than I, but there are alternatives, and Tom talked about how he used them, but it didn't quite work for him for probably all sorts of agronomic and climatic reasons, and they're pyrethroids and others that are tested within the regime that we have in this country. There is regime that's come from Europe, which is, as Dave said, the best in the world in a way, in terms of checking against impacts on aquatic health, the wildlife and our health in terms of residues, and that's important. What we're looking for, though, isn't replacing one really bad with something slightly less bad. Ideally, we'd be working towards IPM and ideally a lot more organic. I would agree with John. We should have a lot more organic here. In Europe, some countries, they've got 30% of their land under organic management, and they celebrate organic as a great one without dissing the other farming and celebrating in shops and things. Anyway, so there are alternatives, but looking to get that farmers on a journey of the whole farm approach, which uses nature and maximum, creates the kind of nutrient environment for the plants that they can withstand with disease better, so you don't get so much loss. All these kind of things is complicated, and that requires advice, demonstration, support.
Well, I think it's that thing of like, we've got to start where we are now. There's a lot of things we've covered tonight. I think to wrap things up, I'd like to ask each of you, sort of like if you've got like a really, like a single sentence that would be like, this is what we need to do from starting where we are now. This is how we're going to solve this problem and make sure we do not use these pesticides ever again in this country. John, what would that be? What's the one sort of, magic golden bullet, if you like, to solve this problem, if there is one?
I think for me, it's about observing what's going on my farm at a very sort of detailed level. And so I just think it's, to any farmer sort of watching it, really understand your impacts of the actions you take on your farm and make sure that you feel happy about them.
Okay, that wraps it up. Thank you. Anabel, one thing that you would do?
Well, be curious, ask about where your products come from, and vote with your wallet with people that you trust, and work together and collaborate.
Thank you so much. I'm actually stunned because normally, like when people answer these questions, they go, I'm like, wow, you guys have really thought about this. Thank you. Dave.
Yeah, I don't know where to start actually, but I
Okay, you
would
can go on.
love to see, I mentioned it earlier, I think we need a national food strategy and I think we need to support that. I don't think the current government are going to do it. In the case of sugar, not least because Vicki Atkins, the health secretary, is married to the chairman of British Sugar. So I don't think she's going to take steps to reduce sugar consumption. But we need to look at what we eat as a nation. It's making us ill. And it's time we try to improve our diet and also eat more sustainable food.
Yeah. Yes. Vicki.
Well, we would want people to share the petition that we've got to put pressure on British Sugar and sign it and share it as wide as you can. I think we've got 40,000 people signing it, and support us next year when we ask for no more derogations, end of, please. And you could start to actually writing to your MP and the parliamentary candidates, because this is an election year, asking them to commit publicly in print to actually say, I will ask, I will make sure our government, whichever government comes in, I'm apolitical, to commit to have no more derogations on neonics. Just as a bottom line. And obviously there's loads more needs to happen. The National Food Strategy, a really fantastic environmental land management payment scheme, so all farmers can get on the road towards agroecological farming. All those kind of things need to happen, and you can talk to your parliamentary candidates to tell them that's what you want at hustings, and get in touch with your local wildlife trusts to find out what they're doing, to put that pressure on local politicians and national politicians. But in the first instance, do share our petition.
Yes,
Our petition to British Sugar, which ironically, we were talking about competition policy, is a monopoly. There's not many of them. It entire and for that reason, the government has to get involved with dictating prices that they give to farmers, and that's a very weird setup if you think about it. The NFU negotiates what prices beet farmers get. Can't they negotiate an alternative price? Anyway, these are kind of things we should talk to British Sugar about doing. But when you've got a monopoly, it's a very odd situation and isn't conducive to letting many flowers bloom in the industry, the food industry, as Anabel talks about, and think about what can really happen at a local level or a regional level in terms of new crops and new opportunities. Sorry, that I really didn't do the one sentence. I'm sorry,
but
Gillian.
that was all good stuff, because absolutely. I mean, I think just for me, there's the one thing that I've come away with is that last year, 40% of farmers chose not to spray,
Yes,
even though
exactly.
they could. So that tells us something that, there is a hunger for change. And
Absolutely.
I think, for all of us as consumers and, researchers, everyone involved in conservation and, or just, people who care, it's really, really important to know that there is actually, it's a rare thing, I think, in these situations where there is one place to go that could make a huge change, and that's British Sugar. So I just wanted to thank all of you for being here tonight. It's been absolutely fascinating. Just want to thank the audience for all the comments, the questions. Apologies if I know we haven't gotten around to all of your questions tonight. We've run out of time. Just know, though, that the team have been reading them all. I've seen them scrolling past. So thanks again to everyone on the panel. If you enjoyed tonight, then don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll find out more about other wildlife events coming up. Obviously, don't forget about that petition. Please sign it. Please share it. This is our chance to really get behind and support beet farmers to make the change that so many of them seem to want to make. I tell you what, it's been really good fun. I've enjoyed it. This is my first Wild Live. It's been really great and a pleasure and a privilege to be here instead of Craig, who is away at the moment. I'm going to just do a little shameless plug of my own. I've got a podcast. It's called If I Rule the World, and I have interviewed Craig Bennett for it. It's been really fascinating, a chance to find out all about his kind of like genesis, how he got into this very laser sharp focus in activism, environmentalism, conservation, his work at Friends of the Earth, and obviously his work now with the Wildlife Trust. So that's going to be coming up in a couple of weeks' time on If I Rule the World. And this Friday it's weird. I'm not only focusing on Wildlife Trust stories, but it's another Wildlife Trust story, the Gwent Wildlife Trust and their campaign to protect the Gwent levels and the developments there on the SSSIs. So yeah, that's my little shameless plug, my podcast on Spotify and on Apple as well. So once again, yeah, thank you all for listening. And if there is one thing you do tonight, obviously there are books, there are podcasts, there's YouTube channels to subscribe to, but really the one most important thing is to sign that petition and share away. So that's all from me. That's all from all of us tonight. Good night.